Right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Hope you're having a lovely day. We're going to have a little bit of a laid back rambling ramble today. A little bit of a laid back rambling ramble. I want to talk about a book called Stalin's War by a guy called McMeekin. It's kind of like I guess you could argue a mainstream author. Yeah, mainstream author, American. You can see him on Fox News talking to people if you search his name on YouTube. But it's an excellent book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I recently read it. I want to talk about it for an hour. Have a little bit of a ramble about the Second World War. That's what we're going to do today. I'm sorry I haven't made many videos recently. This year has been complete chaos for me. Very much up and down and all over the place. Different jobs, different routines, different things going on, which makes it difficult to concentrate on making videos. But I think from this point onwards, moving forwards, I'll probably be able to bash one out every weekend. So that's what I'm going to try and do. I want to carry on with the book reviews. I still want to create a book club, which I've talked about many times before. I've got a partner in crime, and he's also reading books, and we're going to be doing some more of that at some point in the future. You can find me on Goodreads. If you search for Alfred the Invincible, there is a website. In case you didn't know, there's a website. It's called goodreads.com. And there's not really much censorship on this website. As far as I've seen it's very open to all kinds of different ideas, which I think is very telling, because real intellectuals, not that I call myself an intellectual, but you know what I mean, pseudo-intellectuals, people that are interested in reading, people that are genuinely interested in reading and in books and in ideas, they usually tend to be anti-censorship because they're interested in ideas, right? And they're capable of reading something psychotic and dismissing it and coming to their own, creating their own thoughts and opinions on it. They don't need to be force-fed other people's opinions. So they're usually quite anti-censorship, and this is why I am interested in collecting together a group of people that want to just read books and talk about books. Interestingly enough, I am about halfway through, because I tend to read like 4 or 5 books at the same time and just like get halfway through, put it down, and then come back to it and finish it. But I'm halfway through John Robinson's Proofs of a Conspiracy, which, if you don't know, is the original conspiracy theory book that was written at the end of the 18th century, after the French Revolution. And he's talking about that, and he's talking about the Bavarian Illuminati and all of these things. One of the things he mentions is that in that group of people, they had a reading club. That's how they recruited members. Essentially, they would capture intelligent people, find intelligent young men who were interested in ideas. They like to read, so they'd start a book club, and then they're in the book club, and they gradually kind of shifted them towards the right books, So obviously I don't want to create the Bavarian Illuminati, and I don't approve of that organization, but nonetheless I can understand the mindset that they have. If you get together an intelligent group of people who are interested in history, they're interested in ideas, they want to read, they want to have their mind blown. Okay, this book, Stalin's War, it kind of blew my mind. I've got to be honest with you. I'm reading another book right now called Debt by David Graeber. Some Jewish guy wrote a book about the history of debt. It's kind of blowing my mind, right? So there are people out there who they want to read a book which just makes them look at the world in a totally different way, right? These are the kinds of people that you can introduce new ideas to, and they are capable of taking them on. So what we need to do is we need to create a book club. We need to organize it on goodreads.com. Everybody can start their profile on there, and you can list what books you've read. And then if we have many, many different people with their profiles on goodreads.com, you could send a message to someone and say, "Oh, have you read that book? Have you read that book? That's an interesting book. I'd love to talk about that book, right? And then you do like a 1 hour conversation, interview, whatever you want to call it, meeting on YouTube, talking about that book. And in that way, you could gather together a group of intelligent people that like to read and gradually steer them in the right direction, I suppose, or gradually, expand everybody's mindset. Because there are a lot of people in the dissident right, or in the truth movement, so to speak, who essentially they remain within their own little school of thought and they don't really step outside of it, or they're scared of optics, or they're scared of this, that, and the other, or whatever. I don't know. Like, I'm involved in this whole thing because I like interesting ideas, fundamentally. I mean, yeah, there's the practical, political side of it, but really it's just... I mean, what keeps me going is just like, wow, that's amazing. That blew my mind, That's what keeps me coming back year after year after year. It's like, oh, that's a really interesting perspective, right? So as long as you're tapping into that curiosity, you will always be fresh, and you will always have inspiration, and you will always be inspired, right? So there's my little tangent, my little prep talk at the beginning of the video. That's what's going on here. I'm going to try and get back in the habit of making at least one video a week, talking about something. And I want to do book reviews. And do go and check me out on goodreads.com. I haven't listed every book on it because I don't know, I just want to get the ball rolling first, you know what I mean? But if you see a book on there and you want to chat to me about it, send me a message. Maybe we can have a chat. And then we can get a gang of lads together and we'll read and talk about stuff, So, excuse me. So, Sean, is it Sheen or Scene or Sean? Anyway, yeah, Sean, obviously Sean. Sorry, I'm a little bit retarded sometimes. Drinking last night, Saturday night last night, whatever. Sean McMeekin, okay? So, an Irishman, there you go. The Eternal Irishman. Wrote a book called Stalins War. Very much enjoyed it. Essentially, the conclusion of the book is that Stalin won World War II. Right? The Americans like to say they won it, but really Stalin won it. Stalin won the war. Stalin got pretty much everything that he wanted. He got Eastern Europe. He got Lend-Lease, he got Eastern Europe, and he got China as well. I mean, he didn't directly get China, but he got the money in order to fund Mao, and then Mao conquered China, and we had a communist China. So he won again and again and again, got everything that he wanted, and was essentially a master manipulator throughout the whole course of the war. Arguably helped to start the war in the first place by encouraging Germany to get into a fight with the British Empire and with France. And it's something that's kind of, I guess, overlooked because of the whole myth of America saves the world, right? My takeaway from the book is that the Second World War, I mean, I knew this already, but this is just really, really brought it home for me. Really, really made it clear, because I didn't know too much about the Chinese side of things. But my takeaway from the book is that the Second World War has got to be the greatest diplomatic disaster, or the greatest missed opportunity, or the greatest political fuck up, essentially, of the 20th century. And Roosevelt was a complete moron, because Roosevelt sponsored Stalin, as we all know. As we all know, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. We had mass devastation on the Eastern Front. The Germans were marching towards Moscow. They could have won it. They could have beaten the Soviets, and history would have looked completely different. I'm not saying this would have been a good thing. It certainly would not have been good for the Slavic people, who Hitler wanted to enslave and replace. There are a lot of white nationalists, as you know, neo-Nazi white nationalists. They like to post memes on the internet. Hitler is our hero, Hitler is the savior of the white race, etc., etc. Well, Hitler loved Germanic people, for sure. He didn't have a very high opinion of Slavic people. And he had a plan, for living space, as we all know, and he had a plan to genocide and enslave them. So neo-Nazis on the internet, for some reason, they like to put forward the concept that Hitler wanted to save the Russians from the Bolsheviks. This is just completely untrue. This is not the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is Hitler wanted to conquer that land in order to find breeding room, growth for the German people. That's what it was. And the Slavic people would have just been wiped out or pushed into Siberia or whatever. So Hitler winning that war would not have been good for the Slavic people. In the long term, it wouldn't have been good for us here in England, because eventually they would have turned around and invaded us. I mean, this is how the whole First World War started. The Germans wanted to compete with us on the world stage, so it would only have been a matter of time before that happened. But nonetheless, history would have been different. History would have been completely different if Roosevelt hadn't have saved Stalin, essentially. But he did save Stalin with Lend-Lease, with all the free guns and bullets and supplies and etc., etc. that were given to him. He did save Stalin, and he did it with no strings attached. And my takeaway from the book is that essentially Roosevelt had an opportunity to restore order to Europe and to restore peace and democracy to the entire world, which, by the way, was always the American plan. This was Woodrow Wilson's plan, his New World Order. The phrase itself, New World Order, comes from Woodrow Wilson. So, famously, the Americans entered the First World War. Essentially, Woodrow Wilson promoted an idea which is known as Wilsonianism or Wilsonian idealism. So there are two kind of ways of looking at politics. You have political idealism and political realism. Wilson was an idealist. And we kind of still live in this age now, by the way. We do live in the New World Order. In case, I know you see Alex Jones, we have to defeat the New World Order. No, the New World Order is America. America is the New World. And the old world order was the order of the British Empire. So the New World Order was always about tearing down the British Empire, tearing down British imperialism, and establishing a new world democratic order based on the Republican model of the United States of America. Basically, make the whole world like America, and creates a League of Nations or a United Nations to rule over it and bring an end to war and so on and so forth. It's not, on the surface of it, not an entirely bad idea. Wouldn't it be nice if the whole world was like America? It kind of doesn't really work in practice, though. But that is an idealistic goal. It is a politically idealistic goal in that you have a far-fetched ideal upwards in the sky, an ideology, a dream, a utopia, perhaps, that you want to aim for, and politically you are aiming for that. As opposed to political realism, which is all about, we need the guns, we need the money, we need the resources, we need the population, we need to, and who cares about the religion or the ideals or the quote-unquote human rights or the rest of it, right? So we live in the age of the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson and his dream of liberating the world to make way for democracy. And it seems that Roosevelt believed in this as well. It's just because he wanted to create the United Nations, and they sorted this out in the meeting in Yalta, as far as I remember off the top of my head. So Roosevelt wanted a United Nations, but he was hoodwinked by Stalin, and instead of creating world democracy, which he had the power to do because he had all the leverage over Stalin. I mean, let me make it really crystal clear. Stalin could not have won that war without Roosevelt. I mean, you never know what's going to happen in history, right? Perhaps it could have happened, but really, it's very doubtful that he would have, because the Germans kicked the shit out of them. I mean, we know this. And Germany had half conquered Russia, and they'd taken so much of the industrial heartland and so much of the population base. It would have been very, very difficult for them to push back and to win. Could have happened, but probably wouldn't have. But the point being, Roosevelt had an incredible amount of political leverage over Stalin. Stalin needed Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not need Stalin. Nobody was invading America. America was safe. The American public didn't even want to be in the war, for starters. I mean, Roosevelt, nothing was just a complete liar. He got elected on a campaign to keep the boys out of the war, right? So Stalin needed Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not need Stalin. And yet Roosevelt gave all of the wealth of America to Stalin, allowed Stalin to defeat the Nazis, and allowed Stalin to fund Mao in order to conquer China. He gave him all of this, and he gave it to him for free, with no political strings attached, when he should have. He should have said to Stalin, okay, mate, we'll help you out. We'll give you the money, but at the end of the war, you got to give back Poland, you got to give back Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, and, well, stop invading Finland, and you got to give back Romania and all the Eastern European countries. Essentially, you have to give all these countries back. And on the Eastern Front, Roosevelt could have simply funded I'm probably messing this guy's name up. Chiang Kai-shek. So essentially, as I'm sure you're aware, I don't know too much about the Chinese Civil War, but China used to be run by an emperor. They had a revolution in 1911. Sun Yat-sen became the president of the newly formed Republic of China. He was replaced by a guy called Yuan Shikai, and who attempted to restore the monarchy in China, and then he died, and then there was a power struggle, and then this led to a war between essentially the Chinese Communist Party and the Republic of China, and this was going on all throughout the Second World War. It started before the Second World War. Actually, it started in 1927 to 1936, and then continued onwards, and then it's all combined with the Japanese invading as well. So it's a giant, massive clusterfuck, essentially. But to just simplify things, you had, at the time of the Second World War, you had two opposing groups. You had Chiang Kai-shek on the one hand, who was a Republican, who held the same opinions, essentially, as far as we understand it, as Woodrow Wilson. Interestingly enough, he was trained in Moscow, but that's because after the revolution, he tried to get help from Western countries. They didn't give it to him, so he went to Moscow instead. So I don't know, but whatever the case, he represented the Republic, the ideals of democracy. And then on the other hand, you had Mao. Okay, of course, in the end, Mao won the war, and the Republicans, the Kuomintang National Revolutionary Army, they all got kicked out and they went to Taiwan. Now, we've seen what's happened to Taiwan. Taiwan is I've never been there, but by all accounts, it's a nice place to live. Very much like Japan. Peaceful, Chinese, low level of crime, democratic, religious freedom, freedom of speech, just basic Eastern Asian ethno-nationalist utopia, essentially. Of course, those countries aren't that utopian, are they? Because they've been crippled by feminism, and so the birth rate has been destroyed in Japan and in South Korea, and I don't know, probably in Taiwan as well. I've got no idea, but we all know the problems with those countries. But nonetheless, it is a sophisticated, high IQ, clean, organized, high-tech, safe and efficient country in which to live. It's got its problems, but it's basically a nice place, and it's certainly a lot nicer than the utter hellhole that China became in the 20th century. So that is what Chiang Kai-shek's, that's what his army created. That's what his people created after he lost the Chinese Civil War and had to retreat to Taiwan. And so that is what the whole of China could have been like. That's the point I'm trying to get to here. The whole of China could have been like Taiwan. It could have been a nice place to live. You wouldn't have had the Great Leap Forward. You wouldn't have had the Chinese famine. You wouldn't have had all that stupid stuff with the Chinese. What did they do? They killed all the sparrows or something. And then they had a plague of locusts just swarming everywhere and eating everything. You know, just all kinds of crazy stuff. You wouldn't have had all this barbaric, psychotic culture, communist culture in China. You wouldn't have had the technocracy that we have now. Okay, we all know, what's the name of that Jew? Henry Kissinger. Yeah, Henry Kissinger opened up China, introduced the philosophy of technocracy to China, and so now they have the social credit score, essentially, in a mass surveillance state. And Kissinger was instrumental in moving the industrial base from America to China, industrializing it, turning it into this, not exactly communist, but technocratic. I think that's what the globalists want to create. It's a technocracy. It's, you know, it's not communism. It's a technocracy. It's a world ruled by computers and machines and mass surveillance and social credit scores and so on and so forth. It's not as idealistic as communism. Communism, they openly wanted to create some kind of beautiful utopia. Well, you know how communism works. It's like first you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then that gradually at some point, by some miracle, once you've killed all the rich people, everything's supposed to collapse back into communism where nobody owns anything, right? I think the rulers of our world have kind of given up on that. Now they just want to manage technocracy, and China appears to be the breeding ground for that. We do very much live in the age of the rising power of China. We've had the Chinese lockdowns. Our country is following. I mean, let's just like drive this point home. We followed a Chinese style of lockdown in order to deal with the flu, right? Otherwise known as COVID. So, point being, none of that would have happened. None of that would have happened if Roosevelt had funded Chiang Kai-shek. Roosevelt had funded him directly. I mean, think of the millions that was given. It's not even millions, it's billions. I mean, I've heard it's difficult because inflation changes everything. But I mean, some people say like $1 trillion worth of resources were given to Russia in modern day terms during the Second World War. It could be more than that. Who knows? If Roosevelt had given a fraction of that money to Chiang Kai-shek, then Chiang Kai-shek could have beat the Japanese, beaten Mao, taken over the country, and all of China could have looked like Taiwan. We wouldn't have to deal with any of these problems, right? See what I mean? So what I'm trying to say here, my dear friends, is that the story of the 20th century, a big part of the story of the 20th century, is the Cold War, is the struggle against communism, right? Basically, I mean, that is the story of the 20th century, right? It kicks off with the Bolshevik Revolution and then rolls on from there all the way up to 1989, Berlin Wall came down. 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, something like this. So, and they were still dealing with the Labour Party now, and etc., etc. But nonetheless, it is the story of the 20th century. The big power struggle was the struggle between America and the Soviet Union, essentially. That's the Cold War. That would never have happened if Roosevelt had been more intelligent. That's it. The guy's a complete idiot. A total muppet who just gave unlimited amounts of wealth away to a psychotic, genocidal Russian dictator because what? Because he thought he was a good guy, and because he got hoodwinked essentially just by a massive communist spy network which was deeply embedded in America and also in the British. We had a bunch of these people as well, just manipulating stories, specifically when it comes to Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek. When it comes to Chiang Kai-shek, they did a job on him in that obviously America was engaged in a war with Japan, and the communists that were embedded in the American government just made lies up, and they said, well, Mao's doing all the fighting and Chiang Kai-shek's doing nothing, when the reality, the opposite is the reality. Chiang Kai-shek was doing all the fighting against the Japanese, and the Mao was doing nothing. He was on his, what was it called, the Great Long March, the giant retreat that he did, where he marched like a 200, 300 miles or whatever through the mountains of China. But they lied about him, they smeared him, they slandered him. Roosevelt fell for all of this slander, and so they didn't give him the money. And that's it, that's China down the shithole. Totally wasted opportunity. So, my major take, obviously it's a long, winding, what were we on, like 27 minutes? Yeah, I can't talk about the entirety of the Second World War in a 1 hour review of this book, because it's such a huge subject matter. So I'm just giving you the briefest of briefest takeaways, which is that Lend-Lease was a total disaster. Roosevelt had the power in his hands. Roosevelt could have created the kind of New World Order that he wanted. A collection of nations, free, democratic, living under the rule or the watchful eye of America and the United Nations, and having elections and engaging in Western-style capitalism. He could have had this. Instead, he funded his enemies. And they just turned against him straight away once they'd taken all of his money. So it's the story of the Second World War is essentially the story of Stalin ripping off America. All right? Or at least that's the way this book is told. Now, you know me. My perspective on history is that history is subjective. And this book points it out more than anything. And what I mean by that is that it's a complicated story, and you always have to take the side of your own nation and your own people. I was talking to SJJ about this, the other day on a live stream. And he was saying he thinks it undermines my position, because I've always pointed out that, like, Winston Churchill did not start the war, Hitler started the war, and that British nationalists are completely stupid and retarded for siding with Adolf Hitler, because you have to side with your own team. And, I was saying to SJJ, history's subjective. If I was German, I would have supported Hitler, right? If I was born in Germany right now, I would support Adolf Hitler, because I would support my team, and I would spin the historical facts in a way that made it seem that Hitler was the good guy. SJJ thought it undermined my position, or the authority of my position, or the authority of the argument which I was presenting, which is that Hitler was an idiot who started a war that nobody wanted, because that's the fact. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if Hitler had simply sat in Germany as the dictator of Germany, and if he had not have invaded Austria, then the war would never have happened, because nobody wanted a war. France didn't want it, Poland didn't want it, England didn't want it, nobody wanted it. And that's a fact as far as I'm concerned. Now, Stalin may have invaded later on, but he would have had to go through Poland first. And if Hitler really cared about the white race and European people, he would have fought with the Polish against Stalin. Instead, he did the opposite. He teamed up with Stalin, a totally psychotic, genocidal, Bolshevik murderer, and he just annihilated the Polish. And for some reason, white nationalists think that Hitler's some kind of hero, and then they shit on Winston Churchill, saying, "Oh, Churchill abandoned the Polish." It's just insane, right? It doesn't really make any sense. But nonetheless, that's my objective. That's what I think, the key story or the key takeaway of the Second World War is. But if I was German, I'd tell a different story. So what I'm trying to say here is that this world is a struggle. Thomas Malthus was right. Thomas Malthus is the guy that wrote the book called Principles of Population after the French Revolution. A lot of books written after that revolution, which kind of changed the world. Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of modern feminism. John Robinson, the father of modern day conspiracy theory. Thomas Malthus, talking about population control. Edmund Burke, the father of modern day conservatism. A lot of books, right? But Malthus was one of these guys. He is essentially the father of ethno-nationalism, or the grandfather of it, because Darwin came in his footsteps. Arthur de Gobineau, who is the real father of ethno-nationalism, French guy, wrote a great book, actually. I've never talked about it, but good book. All these people were following in the footsteps of Malthus. What did Malthus say? Malthus said that population is either controlled by misery or vice. Misery or vice. So you cannot control sex desire. Men are driven to have sex. They will have sex. You can't stop them doing it. And what happens when you have sex? You make children. So human sex desire pushes people to have more children than they can feed, essentially, because the resources on this planet are limited and it takes time to cultivate land. And so the population is always going to grow, and that population is always going to be limited either by misery or vice. Misery means war, plague, famine, natural disasters, starvation, etc. Right? Civil war, violence. And vice means not getting married, using condoms, contraception, homosexuality, transsexuality, sterile sex. Sterile sex enjoyment and killing your babies, basically, one way or another, to control the population. So this is what Malthus said, and I believe this is to be true. People paint Malthus as a demon. I don't think he's a bad person. If you actually read his book, he was quite a religious man, and he said this is just the way that God created the world. This world is a struggle. This world is a meat grinder. This world is a difficult place in which to live, and that's why we pray to the Supreme Being, because so we can transcend it, right? So that's what Malthus said, and I think Malthus is true. And if Malthus did not come to this conclusion, but my conclusion or my solution to the Malthusian problem is that what you have to do is you have to make population control somebody else's misery. So breed and train your people to fight, and then fight against the other races and the other nations of the world in order to take their resources. And that's what's going on. That's the history of the world. Different groups of men gathering together under the flag with their kin and struggling against each other for resources so they can have sex and feed their children. Basically, that's the history of the world. And so what is history? History is the story of that struggle. That's what it is, essentially, when it comes to political history anyway. I mean, religious history is something else. Religious history is a story of trying to transcend that. But when it comes to political history, when it comes to the history of England, it is the story of the struggle for resources. That's what it is at its core. And so the story, in my opinion, should be a triumphant story. And essentially, when I look at history, I look at it from a heuristic point of view, in that England is good. That's the conclusion, right? Heuristic thinking is a mode of philosophical thought in which you have the conclusion at the beginning and you work backwards to justify the the conclusion, right? So I am engaged in heuristic thinking. I think England is good, we are the best, and then I go backwards and I justify it. And I'm doing this because I think that is the morally right thing to do, because history should be a triumphant history that encourages English men to fight, so that we can get resources, so that we can dominate the world, so that we can conquer the world, so that we can have children and feed the children, right? So worshipping Adolf Hitler doesn't help that story, okay? If you want to be, we have to look at the Second World War from a triumphalist point of view. We cannot ignore the Second World War. The number of people that come up to me and they just say, "Oh, why you keep talking about the Second World War?" First of all, it's interesting. Second of all, you can't talk about politics without talking about history. You can't do it. I mean, you can, but you're just going to have the most boring, retard level, reactionary commentary, which is just shit. And I guess maybe that's part of the problem. I guess maybe most people want that. You know, I like Paul Joseph Watson, but let's face it, he is a reactionary. That's all he does. He literally just says, "This thing happened in the news. Oh my God, imagine my shock." And that's about as deep as it goes, right? Even the Lotus Eaters, I mean, they're pretty good actually, because they do a lot of in-depth stuff. But you watch the podcast, and a lot of it's just Sargon like rolling his eyes, and it's like, well, can you give me a little bit more in depth instead of just tutting and huffing, like, "Oh, we already know why this is stupid." Like, can you just articulate it a bit more? But anyway, if you're not talking about history, then all you're doing is reacting to what's happening in the news, and that's boring. I mean, it's okay, it's necessary. I think it's good that there's a massive online mob reacting to things, but you need to talk about history. And the Second World War is the most important historical event of the 20th century. It is the event that totally reshaped and transformed our world, and we still live in its shadow, and we will continue to live in its shadow until something else comes along which remodels the world again, until there is another power shift. Because what happened in the Second World War? The British Empire fell, the American Empire rose. That's the war. That's essentially the conclusion of the war, in brief. Right? We got mugged off by our ally. Right? Our mutated, rebellious child, our colony, our satanic colony, because they are satanic. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like Americans, right? But let's face it, Washington, there's a giant pentagram like carved into the streets with a Masonic temple at the top of it. I don't know if like, maybe there's like a whole generation of Zoomers coming up and they're getting involved in politics and they just don't know this stuff. Like a whole generation of Zoomers, and they don't even know 9/11 was an inside job. I don't know, man. It's like the older you get, it's like, wow, you've really got just like go over the stuff again and again and again. But there is a sacred geometry out there. You can look this stuff up. You can look at Washington. Maybe I'll read the book about it and do something on that. I'll have to do that at some point. But essentially, when they built Washington City, they carved a giant pentagram into it. Okay, a 5-pointed star. And 5-pointed stars are used in witchcraft, in the occult, in order to summon demons. And that is what Washington is. And the American flag was the first flag in the world to have that pentagram in its flag. You can see it in China, you can see it in Brazil, you can see it in a lot of flags now. It is a Masonic symbol, essentially. It's a symbol of Lucifer, it's a symbol of Venus. Of course, I don't think Venus is a bad planet, but whatever. In the Western context, it is an occultist symbol for summoning demons, and it's right there at the heart of America. The American Revolution was a Masonic revolution funded by Jews and pushed forward by the Irish. And I mean, to be fair, I'm kind of 50-50 on it. Like I think it would have been better. I believe in liberty, and I believe in universal male suffrage, and the American Revolution definitely pushed that subject matter forward for our country. So it had some good effects, but it should have been done. It should have been done in a more peaceful way. They should have kept their king, and they should have kept their Christianity. But what's happened in America is essentially you've got this large, brutish nation who have got daddy issues. They refuse to acknowledge the fact that they are English. They've cut off their relationship with their past, with their ancestors. For most Americans, it seems like history started in 1776, right? And if they go back further than that, they'll talk about the Mayflower. Jamestown was actually the first colony which survived in America, and that was established by King James, a Scottish king, funny enough, but nonetheless, our King James, right? But they don't celebrate that. All the focus is on the Mayflower and the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and that's deliberate in order to cut off the connection between the Americans and the king, and to frame the American success story as a quest for freedom, to escape the clutches of the evil king of England who wanted to persecute the Puritans or something like this, right? So it's the story of America has turned into a story of rebellion, father against son, and it is a nation that is, as I keep saying, it's deleted its history. And if you've cut off your history, then you don't know who you are, and then you're going to get eliminated. And this is why, people can come into America and they can say, well, America is a land of immigrants. Well, they're going to say that if you are in denial of your English heritage. In order for America to survive and thrive, it has to rediscover its English heritage, its ancestors, and then they can fix that country, and then we can fix the whole world. And in order for that to happen, of course, the English have got to rediscover their heritage, which is why we need an English ethno-nationalism. And in order for that to happen, you really have to root it. You have to go back to Hengist and Horsa, and you have to go back to Woden, in my opinion. And then you frame the entire Anglosphere as if it's the Empire of Woden. That's the way I feel about it anyway. So England, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavia, the Empire of Woden. Maybe Germany as well, yeah. The Empire of Woden. One people dominating the world. Even the Russians, I suppose. Well, they killed all their Germanic elements, but obviously the Rus were Germans, weren't they? That's how we're going to save the world. Okay? If you cannot trace the history of your people back to an ancestor, if you cannot trace it back into mythology, you will be lost. You will forget who you are, and you will just become a gay shopping mall, right? Which is what America has become. So, anyway, just to bring that all back, what I was saying is that America, the story of the Second World War is the story of America replacing the British Empire as the rulers of the world. That is what it is in a nutshell. It is the most important event of the 20th century, and you have to talk about it. So I don't know, like, people keep on coming to me and they say, why are you talking about history? You can't not talk about it. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. You have to have the right understanding of what happened in that war. And the point I'm presenting is that we have to have a triumphalist version of that war, which says that we are the best and we won the war for liberty. Obviously, it is a Pyrrhic victory because we lost our empire in the process, but we did the right thing. But the real take, I think, for us is essentially just that the Americans balls it all up. I mean, to be fair, Chamberlain balls it all up as well. Chamberlain balls it all up. I think that needs to be admitted. He should have declared war on the Soviet Union when when they invaded Poland, to be honest with you. Somehow or another, they got away with invading Poland. They got away with invading Latvia and Estonia and the other one. But when they invaded Finland, because Finland fought back, the international community couldn't ignore it, and they had to take the side of Finland, and it created a major diplomatic incident for the Soviet Union. It was really kind of make or break time for a while. And Chamberlain was looking at bombing Baku. Baku is where the Soviet Union was getting its oil from. This is modern day Azerbaijan in the Caucasus, right? They were looking at bombing. They were looking at flying the planes from Iran, bombing Baku, but Chamberlain didn't do it. He didn't have his finger on the trigger, and he didn't initiate. Like, if you, in life in general, if you threaten somebody, you better follow through with that threat. Okay? Chamberlain threatened Hitler. He said, if you invade Poland, it's going to be war. And what happened? Hitler invaded Poland. The Soviets, by the way, waited. They didn't immediately invade Poland. They waited, partly because they wanted the Germans to do all the fighting. Secondly, they wanted to see the reaction of the international community. They only came in at the end to get their, share of the spoils after Chamberlain hesitated. So all of this is to say, I'm not letting the English off the hook. We fucked up. Absolutely. Churchill fucked up as I shouldn't swear. I should stop swearing in these things. But Churchill ballsed everything up as well. But Chamberlain really did mess everything up. We should have bombed Baku, and we should have put boots on the ground straight away in France, and we should have invaded Germany. The French almost invaded Germany, but then kind of like turned around and went back again. If we'd have been more proactive, if we'd have been more on it, we could have prevented the entire war, but we didn't. So I'm not letting us off the hook altogether, but nonetheless, the stupidity of Roosevelt is quite evident. And if you read this book, they point out that, like, Churchill is repeatedly... here's one example. Churchill wanted, after the Americans had taken Italy, they had that big meeting in Tehran, and Churchill wanted... Essentially, you had this big sit-down meeting between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, right? Interestingly, Chiang Kai-shek wasn't invited. I think he had an earlier meeting in Cairo. But Stalin was already pulling moves, right, to support Mao instead of him. Roosevelt apparently wanted him at the table. I mean, this is the interesting thing, just to go on a tangent, but when it comes to the Tehran meeting, that meeting in itself really just brings home how out of balance the relationship was between Roosevelt and Stalin. In that Roosevelt, being an old man, being wheelchair bound, and being actually quite sick, he repeatedly wanted to meet Stalin somewhere closer to home. He did not want to meet him in flipping this place where they ended up meeting, right? But Stalin just refused. So poor old Roosevelt has to get on a plane, go all the way to flipping Tehran. They end up meeting in a Soviet compound where all the rooms are bugged. I mean, it's just absurd. It just really shows you who's in charge. And it shouldn't have been that way because, like I keep saying, Roosevelt had all the power. He had all the leverage. Stalin needed Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not need Stalin, right? But anyway, the Americans had taken Italy. Churchill wanted to invade the former Yugoslavia and move up through Eastern Europe and, attack Germany from that direction. If they had done that, they could have liberated the Eastern European nations. They could have saved Poland, theoretically, probably, possibly, and that would have been great. Stalin said no. Roosevelt agreed. I mean, again, not letting Churchill off the hook. Churchill, I only just found out about this in the reading this book. I didn't know this element of the story, but Churchill completely betrayed the Chetniks and Draza Mihailovic, who, as you know, there was a revolution in Yugoslavia. You had these two factions fighting against the Germans. Sorry, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia. You had these two factions. You had Draza Mihailovic, who was with the Chetniks and who was on the side of the monarchy of Yugoslavia, who was hiding out in London. And then you have Tito, who is the communist. And because of communist agitators in the British intelligence system, essentially they slandered Mihailovic, slandered him, said he was useless at fighting the Germans. So all the money ended up going to Tito, and then Tito ended up obviously creating a communist state at the end of the war. But and that was Churchill. That was Churchill's moronic mistake. But nonetheless, Churchill wanted to invade Yugoslavia, drive up the armies from that direction. They could have saved Europe. They didn't. Why? Roosevelt agreed with Stalin. So, I mean, actually speaking, Churchill kind of comes off quite well in the book, despite that mistake of, various mistakes he makes. He wants, I don't have enough time left in the video to go into, I guess I'll make an entire other video talking about Poland, but to be fair to Churchill, he had his back against the wall, right? England was under immediate threat. England needed America. America did not need England. And England needed Lend-Lease from America. Roosevelt had all the cards, basically. Roosevelt had all the cards in his favor. So he could have saved us and saved the British Empire, gone back to an American isolationist policy, which is what the American people wanted. Nobody in America wanted the American empire. They wanted America first. They wanted American isolationism, right? So he could have done that. He didn't do that. He could have saved China. Instead, it was Roosevelt that pushed forward this idea of no surrender for Germany, or unconditional surrender for Germany. This came out of the Casablanca conference, as far as I understand it. Stalin wasn't present, but again, if you read the book, it's like this weird, and this stuff is not made up. I mean, this stuff is coming from Roosevelt's diary. It's like Roosevelt is trying to impress Stalin. Roosevelt thinks that Stalin is some kind of great communist leader, some kind of hero of the people, or some bullshit like this. It seems like a lot of the things he does is just bending over backwards to impress this guy for whatever reason. But it's Roosevelt that demands unconditional surrender. Otherwise, the war could have ended early. The war could have ended after the first Lend-Lease. Germany fails to take Moscow. The Russians start pushing back, and they could have said to the Germans, right, you faff this up, you're not going to win. Let's call a ceasefire, and we'll go back to the original borders from before the war. And, I mean, maybe Hitler would have taken it, maybe he wouldn't have, but maybe some of Hitler's generals would have got rid of Hitler, and we could have had a peaceful, relatively peaceful solution to the war. But the war was dragged out because of this unconditional surrender thing, which was pushed forward by Roosevelt. Stalin wasn't in a position to push that forward. And because they demanded unconditional surrender and the disarmament of Germany, the Germans continued to fight on. And Churchill was against this. He comes off very well in the book, actually, Winston Churchill. He's against this. There's a conversation where they're saying they want to deindustrialize Germany. Essentially, just wipe out all the factories, take it all away. And they're pointing out that without their industry, Germany will not have a strong enough economy to feed itself, which will lead to the starvation of tens of millions of Germans. And they're openly talking about reducing the population down to 30 million and just driving them back into a medieval state, essentially. And Churchill is visibly upset about all of this. This is not what he wanted. Now, of course, neo-Nazis on the internet, they'll say, oh, but I saw a quote, where Churchill talks about killing the Germans. No, this is bullshit. This is fascist propaganda. Yes, your neo-Nazi heroes on the internet, they do lie about stuff, and they make up quotes that never happened. Okay, so there is this, you can see the, A to Z quotes.com meme thing floating around the internet, and there's a quote by Churchill, and he says, oh, we must crush the Germans and eliminate them and kill their children or whatever. It's bullshit. It's made up. Roosevelt does that, whether intentionally or not, or just through sheer effing stupidity. So, very interesting book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Stalin's War. You might as well call it Roosevelt's War, but it's interesting. In my opinion, again, history is subjective. You can view the war from Stalin's perspective. You can tell the story from Stalin's perspective and line up all the events in a certain way to view it from his perspective. You can view the war from America's perspective. You can view it from England's perspective, or Germany's perspective, or Japan's perspective. And each story, if you just put the different events and the different and you can make a case. You can argue a case for each different nation and what was right and what was wrong. This is another reason why I'm just saying history is subjective. It's because there are many different stories being told at the same time, and even just by writing a book where you put one leader in the center instead of another, it makes the whole story of the war look different. See what I'm saying? You could rewrite this book and make out Stalin to be a hero. Which, to be fair, okay, yes, he was a genocidal, mass murdering psychopath, but he was also fighting against a genocidal, mass murdering psychopath. And if he had lost the war, Russia would not exist anymore. Russia would be Germany, and the Slavic people would be dead and enslaved and gotten rid of. So, like I've said before, a lot of people have disagreed with this, but I'm only following in the footsteps of Bowden, the late great Jonathan Bowden, who said all of these things. Okay, go look it up, go watch his lectures, go see what he said. He talks about, from the Nietzschean perspective, you have to respect the warrior. You always have to support the warrior of your nation, the man that fights. Stalin was a warrior. If your country is getting invaded by bloodthirsty Germans, then Stalin is the kind of man you want to lead your country. Why? Because he's a fucking psycho. He's a psycho. He will do whatever he needs to do to win. And that's what he did. So, was he a nice person? No. Did he save Russia? Yeah. Did he, at the same time he saved Russia, did he brutally murder millions of people and put them in gulags and etc., etc.? Yeah, he was a psycho. But I don't know, man, like, history's ugly, right? History is ugly, the world is ugly, the world is a meat grinder, and I guess it's like Ivan the Terrible, right? That guy wasn't a nice guy, but did he help to form the modern state of Russia? Yeah. Right? So, hero or not, he saved Russia. He won the war. And as I say, Bowden talked about this. Like he talks about the Russian people, how they will teach Solzhenitsyn in Russian schools. Okay, so the Gulag Archipelago and 200 Years Together. These books are known of in Russian culture, but at the same time, they won't go into the path of self-hatred, of hating Stalin. Putin has avoided that, and I think that's sensible for him to do so. Whereas here in this country, well, the masses love Churchill, but the dissident right, for some reason, they think it wise to hate Churchill, which leads into a path of self-destruction. You start hating your war heroes, you end up hating yourself. And that's what's happened to the dissident right, and I've been saying it for years. Gradually, I think people are starting to wake up and see it, maybe. Does that mean Churchill was a nice guy? No. But there you go. You got to understand, we live in the world of Thomas Malthus. Okay, this world is a meat grinder. This world is a bad place. This world is a place of constant war and conflict and struggle. And so you need to support your military heroes, whether they're nice or not, right? And for the Russians, I guess the conclusion of this book and the conclusion of this video is that, yes, Stalin was a total bloodthirsty psychopath, but nonetheless, he conquered half the world, didn't he? I mean, he took the whole of Eastern Europe, didn't he? He hoodwinked Roosevelt and took the whole of Eastern Europe and put it under Russian power. So, you know, that's something, isn't it? You know what I mean? Oh dear. So, I mean, you can imagine, like, in 100 or 200 or 300 years' time, Russians, like, posting memes on the internet, talking about based Stalin, right? In the same way that today, like, Swedes like to talk about the based Vikings. Okay, and I don't know, man, they like to try and downplay it and say, oh no, Vikings didn't really rape and pillage. No, of course they did. You know, and this is where we get into the whole duality of the white nationalist mindset. Like, on one hand, it's like, oh, Vikings are based because they would go out and conquer and kill people with axes and shit like that, right? Powerful warriors, powerful masculine warriors. And then when it comes to Stalin, they're like, oh no, Stalin was evil. What's the difference? You know what I mean? What's really the difference? So anyway, guys, thank you very much for listening. God bless. Have a nice day.